At 7:42 in the morning on March 4, 1918, Seaman William Beese from Lisbon, Iowa, stood on the deck of the largest collier in the United States Navy and watched the harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados, grow smaller behind him. The vessel was the USS Cyclops, a 542-foot steel-hulled collier carrying 309 souls and nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore. The morning sun was warm on his face. The Caribbean waters stretched blue and calm in every direction. It should have been an easy 9-day voyage home to Baltimore. Beese was 23 years old. He had enlisted in Des Moines the previous summer, eager to do his part in the Great War. He had trained at Great Lakes Naval Base and been assigned to the Cyclops because the Navy needed men and the Cyclops needed crew. He had written letters home to his family, telling them about life aboard the massive collier. He was looking forward to seeing American soil again. Captain George Worley had reported fair weather and calm seas. Weather fair, all well. Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from the Cyclops. Somewhere between Barbados and the American coast, the largest collier in the United States Navy vanished. No distress signal, no debris, no bodies, no lifeboats, not even a single cork life preserver floating on the surface. William Beese, and the 308 men with him, simply ceased to exist. The United States Navy launched one of the most extensive search operations in its history. French and American vessels scoured thousands of square miles of ocean. Radio operators tried repeatedly to make contact. Nothing. The Cyclops had disappeared as though some gigantic monster of the sea had grabbed her, men and all, and sent her into the depths of the ocean. The disappearance of the Cyclops remains the single largest loss of life in United States naval history, not directly involving combat. 309 men, gone without a trace. More than a century later, her wreckage has never been found. Her fate remains officially unknown, but the story of what led to that final voyage, the warnings that were ignored, the secrets her captain carried, and the eerie coincidences that would follow reveals something far more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. This is the story of the ship that vanished, and the truth that the Navy buried along with her. The Cyclops was built to be a workhorse, not a warship. She was constructed by William Cramp and Sons Ship and Engine Building Company in Philadelphia, and launched on May 7, 1910. Her name came from Greek mythology, the race of one-eyed giants who forged thunderbolts for Zeus. At 542 feet long and 65 feet wide, she displaced nearly 20,000 tons when fully loaded. She was among the largest vessels in the Navy, a behemoth of steel and steam. Her job was simple but essential. She was a collier, a floating coal mine that kept the fleet fueled and operational. In an era when battleships and cruisers ran on coal, the Cyclops was the lifeblood of American naval power. Without her and ships like her, the most powerful warships in the world would sit dead in the water, unable to fight, unable to maneuver, unable to do anything but wait for someone to bring them fuel. She could carry 12,500 tons of coal and transfer it to other ships at sea using an ingenious system of cables and buckets. Massive clamshell buckets lifted 2 tons of coal in a single mouthful. Cables ran along her deck, sending 800-pound bags of anthracite to vessels steaming alongside. The newspapers called her a floating coal mine. She was, in every sense, the workhorse of the Navy. For 7 years, she served without major incident, voyaging from the Baltic Sea to the Caribbean to the coast of Mexico. She supplied 2nd Division ships in European waters in 1911. She operated from Newport, Rhode Island, to the Caribbean, servicing the Atlantic Fleet. During the American occupation of Veracruz in 1914 and 1915, she coaled ships on patrol and helped evacuate refugees fleeing the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, earning the thanks of the State Department for her cooperation. But the Cyclops had a flaw that would prove fatal. She was designed to carry coal. Her flat bottom and wide beam made her stable when loaded with thousands of tons of anthracite, but they also made her roll badly in heavy seas. Sailors who served aboard her knew the feeling, the sickening lurch as the ship tilted far past what seemed survivable, the long seconds waiting to see if she would right herself. On one occasion she rolled approximately 50 degrees one way and in the high 40s the other, For a ship carrying thousands of tons of cargo, this was terrifying. The men learned to live with the fear, but they never stopped feeling it. In April 1917, America entered the Great War, and the Cyclops became a military asset. She was commissioned into the Navy on May 1, 1917, and her civilian crew was replaced with naval reservists. Many of these men had never set foot on a ship before their wartime enlistment. They came from all walks of life. There were farmers and mechanics, salesmen and tradesmen, a physician from Pennsylvania and teenagers from Baltimore, young men and old from big cities and rural routes. They were assigned to the Cyclops because the Navy needed bodies, and this was where the bodies were sent. And then there was the captain. Lieutenant Commander George Worley was not the man he claimed to be. The Navy knew him as George Worley, a gruff, experienced mariner who had spent decades commanding merchant vessels. He walked the deck carrying a cane, an affectation that made him seem distinguished. He was the only commanding officer the Cyclops had ever known, serving aboard her since she first entered service in 1910. But investigators would later discover that George Worley did not exist. His real name was Johann Friedrich Wichmann. He was born in Sandstedt in the Hanover region of Germany in 1862. At the age of 16, he had jumped ship in San Francisco and spent the next 2 decades reinventing himself as an American. By 1898, he had changed his name to Worley, borrowing the surname from a seaman friend. He was running a saloon in San Francisco's notorious Barbary Coast, a neighborhood famous for its lawlessness, its brothels, and its opium dens. He brought his brothers over from Germany and built a small empire in the shadows. He qualified as a ship's master and began commanding merchant vessels running cargo from the Far East to San Francisco. Some of that cargo was legal. Some of it, according to reports, was opium. The crews of these merchant ships told stories about Worley that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was brutal. He cursed and berated men for trivial offences, sometimes becoming violent. On one occasion, he allegedly chased an ensign around the ship with a pistol. He was compared to Captain William Bligh of the Bounty and to Captain Edward Edwards of the Pandora, men infamous for their cruelty. The sailors who served under him learned to fear him and to hate him. When America went to war with Germany, Johann Friedrich Wichmann, now known as George Worley, was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve. The German-born man with a fake identity was now commanding American sailors in a war against his homeland. The crew called him the damned Dutchman behind his back. They did not trust him. Neither did some of his officers. But the Navy needed experienced captains, and Worley knew the Cyclops better than anyone. So they looked the other way. Conrad Nervig was a young naval officer assigned to the Cyclops in the summer of 1917. He was South Dakota-born, eager to serve, and completely unprepared for what he would find aboard the massive collier. He would later describe his time on the ship in an article for the United States Naval Institute Proceedings written 51 years after the Cyclops disappeared. By then, Nervig had built a successful career in Hollywood, winning Academy Awards for film editing on King Solomon's Mines and other pictures. But the Cyclops haunted him. He never forgot what he had seen. Nervig described Worley as a gruff, eccentric salt of the old school, given to carrying a cane but possessing few other cultural attainments. He was a very indifferent seaman and a poor, overly cautious navigator. Unfriendly and taciturn, he was generally disliked by both his officers and men. This was not the portrait of a capable commander. This was a man who had risen to his position through persistence and deception, not skill. Worley's irrational methods of command, Nervig wrote, created a thoroughly demoralized and disorganized crew. Discipline was harsh but arbitrary. Men were punished for minor infractions, while serious problems went unaddressed. The ship operated in a state of constant tension. Officers avoided the captain when possible. Sailors whispered among themselves about the damned Dutchman and wondered what he might do next. Nervig witnessed an incident that haunted him for decades. One day, an engine was turned over while a sailor was working nearby. The force of the propeller drew in a nearby boat and knocked the sailor overboard. He drowned before anyone could save him. It was an accident, the kind that happens on ships, But Nervig blamed the tragedy on the dysfunction that Worley had created. A well-run ship would not have had men working near an active engine. A competent captain would have ensured proper safety procedures. Worley had done neither, but Nervig was lucky. When the Cyclops reached Rio de Janeiro in January 1918, he received orders transferring him to the USS Glacier. Worley tried to have the orders revoked, apparently fond of the young officer. Fortunately for Nervig, he was unsuccessful. Conrad Nervig left the Cyclops and lived to tell her story. He would spend the rest of his life wondering what happened to the men he left behind. In January 1918, the Cyclops was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service and given a new mission. She was to sail to Brazil, deliver coal to the South American patrol fleet, and return with a cargo of manganese ore. Manganese was essential to the war effort. It was used in steel production, in munitions, in the manufacture of weapons that American soldiers would carry into battle against the Kaiser's armies. The Cyclops would bring back 11,000 tons of it. She departed Norfolk, Virginia on January 8, 1918, loaded to her Plimsoll mark with coal and supplies. The day was cold and overcast with light snow falling. The harbour had been frozen for days. Liberty parties from ships at anchor had walked across the ice that morning returning to their vessels, an unusual sight that spoke to the severity of the winter. The Cyclops ploughed through the ice floes in the ship channel, her bow cracking through the frozen surface as she headed for open water. As she reached the channel, she nearly collided with the USS Survey, outward bound for the Mediterranean and anti-submarine duty. The two ships passed within feet of each other, sailors on both vessels shouting warnings that went unheeded. It was the first of many bad omens. By nightfall, the Cyclops had cleared the Virginia Capes and headed southward, breasting the heavy winter seas with a speed and ease that amazed her crew. Despite everything, she was a capable ship. She just needed a capable captain. The voyage south was troubled from the start. The ship rolled badly in the heavy winter seas, her flat bottom making her unstable in the swells. Nervig, still aboard at this point, recalled the terror of watching the deck tilt far past what seemed survivable. He had served on other ships. He knew what normal rolling felt like. This was not normal. This was a ship that wanted to capsize. Navigation was equally alarming. On the 12th day, the Cyclops came in sight of the coast of South America off Pernambuco, at a distance of about 20 miles. Captain Worley immediately changed course to take them farther out to sea. They anchored off the city of Bahia on January 22nd, having overshot the harbour entrance by 48 miles. The navigator had protested, pointing out that they were heading past their destination. Worley brusquely overruled him. 3 more hours of darkness, steaming on that course, would have run the ship aground. It was only luck that they spotted land in time. The Cyclops arrived in Rio de Janeiro on January 28, 1918. For 2 weeks she unloaded her coal and took on manganese ore. The process was laborious. Manganese ore is dense, far denser than coal. A cubic foot of coal weighs about 50 pounds. A cubic foot of manganese ore weighs more than twice that. The Cyclops had spent her entire career carrying coal. Her crew knew how to load it, stow it, and secure it. Manganese was different. It was heavier. It behaved differently. It required different calculations, different ballasting, different precautions. The only officer aboard with experience loading manganese ore was the executive officer, the second in command, but he was not available to supervise the loading. Captain Worley had placed him under arrest and confined him to his quarters over what Conrad Nervig later described as a trivial disagreement. The nature of the dispute was never made public, but its consequences would prove catastrophic. With the one man who understood the cargo locked in his cabin, the manganese was loaded by men who had never handled it before. There were other problems. Before leaving Rio, Worley submitted a report to the Navy, stating that the starboard engine had a cracked cylinder and could not be used. The ship would have to make the return voyage on a single engine. A survey board reviewed his report and recommended that the Cyclops proceed to the United States for repairs. It was a bureaucratic compromise that prioritized expediency over safety. The ship was damaged, but not badly enough to justify keeping her in Brazil while a war raged. She would limp home on one engine and be fixed in an American shipyard. No one seemed to consider what might happen if the remaining engine failed in the open ocean. No one seemed to consider what might happen if the improperly loaded cargo shifted in heavy seas. No one seemed to consider that they were sending a damaged ship, with a demoralized crew and an unstable captain, into waters where German submarines were known to operate. The Cyclops was being set up to fail, and fail she would. The Cyclops departed Rio de Janeiro on February 16, 1918, with 309 souls aboard. In addition to the crew, she carried several passengers whose presence would later fuel conspiracy theories that persisted for decades. One was Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the American consul general in Rio de Janeiro. Gottschalk was returning to the United States to enlist in the army. He was a controversial figure, reportedly of pro-German sympathies despite his position representing American interests. His presence aboard a ship commanded by a German-born captain would later be cited as evidence of a conspiracy to hand the vessel over to the enemy. Another group of passengers were prisoners, military convicts being transported back to the United States for incarceration. Among them were men convicted of murder aboard the armored cruiser USS Pittsburgh. A third-class fireman named Oscar Stewart had been found dead in a pool of blood in one of the boiler rooms. Several men had been court-martialed for the crime. Bernard DeVoe received a life sentence. Moss Whiteside received 15 years. James Coker received death. They were placed aboard the Cyclops in irons to be transported back to American soil for punishment. The ship stopped briefly in Salvador to pick up mail from the naval vessels stationed there, then continued north. She was supposed to sail directly to Baltimore with no additional stops, but on March 3rd, the Cyclops made an unscheduled visit to Barbados. The reason for the stop was alarming. The ship was riding too low in the water. Officials in Barbados noted that the waterline was above the Plimsoll mark, the line painted on a ship's hull indicating the maximum safe loading depth. Samuel Plimsoll had fought for decades to require this line on all ships after witnessing countless overloaded vessels sink with their crews. If the water was above the line, the ship was dangerously overloaded. The Cyclops was above the line. Captain Worley visited the American consul in Bridgetown, a man named C. Ludlow Livingston. The meeting was strange. Worley seemed reticent, secretive. He claimed he needed 600 tons of coal because he only had enough fuel to reach Bermuda, but Livingston made inquiries and learned that this was false. The ship had plenty of coal, perhaps more than 1,500 tons, more than enough for the voyage to Baltimore. Why was Worley lying? Worley bought fresh meat, flour, and vegetables, paying over $775. He was provisioning heavily, far more than seemed necessary for a 9-day voyage. Was he planning to go somewhere other than Baltimore? Was he preparing for a longer journey, one that might take him across the Atlantic to Germany? Or was he simply a poor planner, buying supplies he did not need because he did not know how to calculate what he would need? On March 4, 1918, the Cyclops steamed out of Bridgetown Harbor and headed north toward Baltimore. Her last known message said, "Weather fair, all well." She was expected to arrive on March 13th. She never did. When the Cyclops failed to arrive in Baltimore, the Navy was slow to react. It was wartime. Ships were delayed all the time. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, forcing vessels to take evasive routes. Perhaps the Cyclops had diverted to another port. Perhaps her single engine had finally given out and she was limping toward the nearest harbor. Perhaps she was maintaining radio silence to avoid detection by the enemy. There were 100 innocent explanations. But as days turned into weeks with no word, concern grew into alarm. The Navy began making quiet inquiries, checking with ports up and down the coast, asking if anyone had seen the massive collier. No one had. She had not put into Bermuda. She had not stopped in Norfolk or Charleston or any of the ports along her route. She had simply vanished. On April 15, 1918, more than a month after the Cyclops had disappeared, the Navy finally released the news to the press. The headlines were shocking. "Collier Cyclops is lost," screamed the Washington Post. 293 persons on board. Enemy blows suspected. The New York Times published a list of the missing, filling an entire column with names: Mothers and fathers across America opened their newspapers and saw their sons listed among the lost. The Navy launched a massive search. Cruisers scoured thousands of square miles of trade routes, beaches and bays. Radio operators tried repeatedly to contact the lost ship. French and American vessels searched the Atlantic from Barbados to the Virginia Capes. They looked for debris, for lifeboats, for bodies. They looked for any sign that the Cyclops had existed at all. They found nothing. Not a shard of wooden lifeboat, not a cork life preserver, not a body, not a piece of cargo washed ashore. Usually a wooden bucket or a cork life preserver identified as belonging to a lost ship is picked up after a wreck, a magazine noted years later. But not so with the Cyclops. She just disappeared as though some gigantic monster of the sea had grabbed her, men and all, and sent her into the depths of the ocean. On June 1, 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared the Cyclops officially lost and all hands deceased. The official date of death for the 309 souls aboard was set as June 14, 1918. It was the single largest loss of life in the history of the United States Navy not directly involving combat. 309 men simply gone. The Navy conducted an extensive investigation into the disappearance. They interviewed anyone who had contact with the ship in her final weeks. They examined German naval records to determine if a submarine had torpedoed her. They scrutinized Captain Worley's background and discovered his true identity as Johann Friedrich Wichmann. They uncovered a web of secrets and suspicions that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. The investigation revealed that Worley was not just German-born, he was suspected of being actively pro-German. His closest friends and associates were either German or Americans of German descent. Many Germanic names appear among the crew, noted the consul in Barbados. The ship's passenger list included Gottschalk, the consul general with reported pro-German sympathies. Was this coincidence or conspiracy? Livingston sent a disturbing telegram to the State Department after the ship vanished. He described Worley as the damned Dutchman and reported that he was generally disliked by other officers. He reported rumors of disturbances during the voyage from Brazil, of men being confined, and of at least one man being executed. He wrote that while not having any definite grounds, he feared a fate worse than sinking, possibly based on instinctive dislike felt towards master. Livingston was suggesting that Worley might have committed treason, that he had handed the ship over to the Germans. It was a sensational accusation, one that captured the imagination of a nation at war. The idea that a German spy had stolen a ship full of American sailors and delivered them to the Kaiser was almost too dramatic to believe. The theory was investigated thoroughly. After the war ended in November 1918, American officials gained access to German naval records. They searched for any mention of the Cyclops. They looked for records of her capture, of her crew being taken prisoner, of her cargo being delivered to German ports. They found nothing. No German submarine had claimed the Cyclops. No German raider had captured her. The German government denied any knowledge of the vessel, both during the war and after. Whatever happened to the Cyclops, it was not enemy action. The treason theory collapsed. But if the Germans had not taken her, what had happened? Theories proliferated in the years following the disaster. Each one tried to explain how a ship the size of a football field could vanish without a trace. Some were plausible, some were fantastical. None could be proven. Some blamed the manganese cargo. The ore was far denser than coal and behaved differently in the holds. The hatch covers on the Cyclops were canvas, not steel. When wet, manganese can absorb water and become a slurry that shifts unpredictably. If the cargo shifted suddenly during rough weather, the ship could have capsized so quickly that no one had time to send a distress signal or launch a lifeboat. One moment the Cyclops was steaming north, the next moment she was upside down and sinking. Others blamed structural failure. The Cyclops and her three sister ships were designed to carry coal, not dense metallic ore. Rear Admiral George Van Deurs later suggested that the longitudinal support beams running the length of the ship, the I-beams that gave her structural integrity, might have eroded due to the corrosive nature of previous cargoes. This corrosion was observed definitively. On the USS Jason, a similar vessel. The freighter Chuki, which had similar construction, actually snapped in two in calm seas. If the Cyclops hit heavy weather with weakened structural members and an overloaded hold full of improperly stowed ore, she might have broken in half. The bow and stern could have been supported by wave crests, while the heavily loaded middle hung unsupported in a trough. The stress would have been enormous. The weakened I-beams would have given way. The ship would have snapped like a twig and gone down in minutes. Conrad Nervig believed this is exactly what happened. He theorized that the manganese ore was stored improperly, concentrated amidships instead of distributed throughout the holds. Remember, the one officer who knew how to load manganese was locked in his cabin. Without his expertise, the crew loaded the ore the way they had always loaded coal. But coal and manganese are not the same. The weight distribution was wrong. The stress on the center of the ship was immense. In heavy seas, Nervig wrote, the stress would have caused the ship to break apart almost instantly. There would have been no time to call for help, no time to lower the boats, just a sudden, catastrophic failure, and then nothing. The bow and stern would have sunk separately, dragging the crew down with them. Within minutes there would have been nothing left on the surface, no debris, no survivors, just empty ocean. The structural failure theory gained terrible credence from a series of coincidences that defied explanation. Two of the Cyclops' three sister ships suffered identical fates. The USS Proteus was the lead ship of the class, launched in 1912. She served without incident in the Navy until being decommissioned in 1924. In March 1941, she was sold to Saguenay Terminals Limited of Montreal, Quebec, and became part of the Canadian Merchant Navy. Her new job was carrying bauxite ore, another dense metallic cargo from the Caribbean to aluminum plants in the United States and Canada. Sometime after November 23, 1941, the Proteus vanished without a trace while steaming through the Caribbean. 58 men were lost. There was no distress signal, no debris, no explanation. German U-boats were operating in the area during World War II, and it was initially assumed that one of them had torpedoed the Proteus. But post-war examination of German records revealed no claim for the vessel. Like her sister, the Cyclops, the Proteus had simply disappeared. The USS Nereus followed an almost identical path. She had served as a collier until being decommissioned in 1922. In February 1941, she was sold to the Aluminium Company of Canada and put to work carrying bauxite ore from the Caribbean. Her master was John Thomas Bennett of the Canadian Merchant Navy. Sometime after December 10, 1941, the Nereus vanished while steaming from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. She was following the same route where the Cyclops had disappeared 23 years earlier. 61 men were lost. Again, no distress signal, no debris, no explanation. The German Navy denied any involvement. 3 ships of the same class, 3 cargoes of dense metallic ore, 3 total disappearances without a trace. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Something was fundamentally wrong with these vessels when they carried heavy ore. The flat bottoms that made them stable with coal made them dangerous with denser cargo. The I-beams that held them together corroded over time, weakening their structural integrity. When loaded with ore and sent into heavy seas, they broke apart so quickly that no one aboard had time to call for help. The fourth sister ship, the USS Jupiter, avoided this fate only because she was converted into something else entirely. Between 1920 and 1922, she was transformed into the first American aircraft carrier and renamed the USS Langley. She never carried ore. She never sailed with a flat bottom full of dense metallic cargo. She survived until 1942 when Japanese aircraft bombed her off Java. Her crew was rescued before she sank. Unlike her 3 sisters, the Langley left survivors and wreckage. Unlike her 3 sisters, we know exactly what happened to her. The disappearance of the Cyclops became foundational to another mystery, one that would capture the public imagination for decades. In the years following the disaster, writers began connecting her loss to other unexplained disappearances in the Western Atlantic. Ships and aircraft that had vanished in the region, bounded roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The area became known as the Bermuda Triangle. The Cyclops was cited as one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of the triangle's supposed supernatural power. Books and documentaries suggested that she had been swallowed by forces beyond human understanding, that something in those waters defied the laws of physics and nature. The story grew more fantastic with each retelling. Giant octopuses dragging ships beneath the waves, underwater volcanoes creating whirlpools, extraterrestrial craft abducting crews, portals to other dimensions opening in the middle of the ocean. The fact that 3 of 4 sister ships had all vanished in roughly the same area only added fuel to the fire. Surely this could not be coincidence. Surely there was something malevolent about those waters. The Bermuda Triangle became one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century, spawning books, movies, and television specials that captivated audiences around the world. But the truth, as researchers like Larry Couchet demonstrated in his landmark 1975 book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, was far more mundane. The triangle was a myth, a collection of incidents that could be explained by weather, mechanical failure, human error, and the simple vastness of the ocean. Ships sink. Planes crash. Sometimes they sink and crash in the same general area because that area sees heavy traffic. There is nothing supernatural about the waters between Florida and Bermuda. There is only the sea, which has been killing sailors since humans first built boats. The Cyclops did not vanish because of supernatural forces. She vanished because of overloading, structural weakness, poor leadership, and the unforgiving nature of the Atlantic. Her fate was tragic, but it was not mysterious. It was the predictable result of sending a damaged ship, with an unstable captain and an inexperienced crew, into dangerous waters with an improperly loaded cargo. She was doomed before she ever left Barbados. The families of the lost sailors waited for answers that never came. In towns across America, mothers and fathers received telegrams informing them that their sons were presumed dead. There were no bodies to bury, no personal effects to return, no closure, just an official date of death and a name on a memorial that most people would never see. Among the lost was Lewis Hardwick, an African-American mess attendant from Atlanta, Georgia. His son, Herbert Lewis Hardwick, would grow up never knowing his father. But Herbert made his own mark on the world. He became a boxer known as the Coco Kid, winning the world-colored welterweight and middleweight championships in the 1930s and 40s. He fought his way to prominence with fists that his father never got to see. There was Dr. Bert Jacob Asper, the assistant surgeon from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, who served as the ship's medical officer. He had joined the Navy after receiving his commission and was assigned to the Cyclops to care for her crew. He also served as the ship's censor, reviewing the letters that sailors sent home to ensure no sensitive information reached enemy hands. An envelope he postmarked on January 28, 1918, bearing his initials BJA within the censor's marking, is now preserved at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library. It is one of the only physical artifacts from the Cyclops that still exists. There was Edward Morgan, Jr., a young fireman from Washington, D.C., who wrote cheerful letters to his mother throughout his time aboard the ship. He told her about life at sea, about the ports they visited, about the friends he had made among the crew. His letters survived and were later donated to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library, where they remain today as one of the few direct testimonies from anyone who served aboard the Cyclops. His final letter arrived at his family's home in mid-March 1918, just days before the Navy announced the ship was missing. In Baltimore, the War Memorial lists the names of Marylanders killed during the Great War. Among them are sailors from the Cyclops: Thomas Lee of West Baltimore, Adam Siewierski of Canton, Charles Holmes, who left behind a wife and infant son on Presbury Street, Edward Dresbach, who had written cheerful letters to his mother on Harlem Avenue, Beverly Jones and Herbert Price, 2 city boys just 17 years old. Their names are inscribed in marble alongside soldiers who fell at Belleau Wood in the Argonne. But unlike those soldiers, their bodies were never recovered. They have no graves to visit. They have only their names, carved in stone. For decades, no one kept the memory of these men alive. The Cyclops was not lost in a glorious battle. She did not go down fighting. She just vanished, and with her vanished the memory of the men she carried. It was not a story that inspired monuments or movies. It was a story that embarrassed the Navy and confused historians. So it was forgotten. Then, in 1997, a man named Marvin Barash began to change that. Barash was about 10 years old when his father first told him about the Cyclops. His great-uncle, Lawrence Merkel, had been a fireman aboard the ship. Merkel was among the first 800 Marylanders to enlist in the Navy when America entered the war. He had been assigned to the Cyclops because that was where they needed men. His name was inscribed on the War Memorial in Baltimore, but that was all the family knew. They had no photographs of him, no letters, no details about how he had lived or how he had died. Barash spent the next 2 decades researching the Cyclops. He gathered naval records, ship logs, photographs, and dispatches. He tracked down descendants of other crew members. He corresponded with historians and archivists around the world. He became obsessed with the ship that had taken his great-uncle, determined to understand what had happened and to ensure that the 309 souls who perished would not be forgotten. He wrote 3 books about the ship, documenting every day of her service that could be reconstructed from surviving records. He located the only genuine envelope ever postmarked aboard the Cyclops, preserved at the Roosevelt Library since 1942. He analyzed positional data from other ships that might help pinpoint where the Cyclops went down. He became the world's foremost authority on a vessel that most people had never heard of. "I just want her to be found," he told a reporter. "I want the 309 to be at rest as well as the families. It is something everybody needs. Some resolution." In 1968, a Navy master diver named Dean Hawes made a discovery that briefly raised hopes of finding the Cyclops. During a search for the missing nuclear submarine USS Scorpion, Hawes descended on a large wreck lying in 180 feet of water about 40 nautical miles northeast of Cape Charles, Virginia. He was amazed by the size of the vessel. It had a bridge on stilts, exactly like the Cyclops. The structure matched photographs he had seen of the lost collier. But bad weather was approaching, and the salvage operation was focused on finding the Scorpion, not investigating old wrecks. Hawes was forced to surface before he could fully explore the vessel. The Navy moved on, eventually locating the Scorpion west of the Azores. The mysterious wreck off Virginia was forgotten. Years later, Hawes saw a photograph of the Cyclops in an article about her disappearance. He was convinced it was the same ship he had explored. The bridge on stilts, the overall dimensions, the location near the Virginia Capes where the Cyclops might have gone down in the storm of March 10, 1918, it all fit. Hawes persuaded the Navy to return to the site, but they found a different wreck, not the one he remembered. The renowned shipwreck hunter Clive Cussler, author of the Dirk Pitt adventure novels, later funded an expedition to relocate the vessel Hawes had discovered. His organization, the National Underwater and Marine Agency, searched the area but came up empty. The wreck that Hawes had found, whatever it was, remained hidden. Dean Hawes died a few weeks after that final search. He took the secret of what he had seen to his grave. Did he really step onto the deck of the Cyclops? Or had he found one of her equally ill-fated sister ships, the Proteus or the Nereus? All 3 vanished in roughly the same area. All 3 remain undiscovered. Perhaps someday, when technology permits us to view the bottom of the sea with the same clarity we can see on land, all 3 ships will be found. In recent years, advances in deep-sea exploration have uncovered warships that were thought lost forever. Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder, spent 8 years and millions of dollars searching for the Japanese Battleship Musashi, the largest warship ever sunk. His team found her in 2015, lying more than half a mile below the surface of the Sibayan Sea in the Philippines. Allen's expeditions also located the USS Lexington, the aircraft carrier lost at the Battle of Coral Sea in 1942, and the USS Juno, the cruiser whose sinking killed the 5 Sullivan brothers. The USS Indianapolis, torpedoed in 1945 with the loss of nearly 900 men, was discovered in 2017 by a different team, using similar technology. These ships had been missing for decades. Modern sonar and remotely operated vehicles found them. Barash believes the Cyclops may lie in the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, the Puerto Rico Trench, which extends more than 27,000 feet below the surface. If the ship went down in that abyss, She may be beyond the reach of current technology, but technology improves every year. Ships that were unfindable a decade ago are being located today. Perhaps the Cyclops will be next. Barish has also worked to ensure that the men of the Cyclops receive the recognition they were denied in life. He contacted the Navy and requested a gravesite marker for his great-uncle Lawrence Merkel, even though no body was ever recovered. The Navy provided one, a cenotaph, the Greek word meaning empty tomb. It was placed in the Crownsville Veteran Cemetery in Maryland. In 2000, Lawrence Merkel was posthumously awarded the World War I Victory Medal, more than 80 years after his death. Barish keeps an American flag with 48 stars, the flag his great-uncle served under. He hopes someday the Navy will present it to him in a formal ceremony, giving final honors to a man who has waited more than a century to receive them. Today, there is still no major memorial to the Cyclops, or the 309 men who vanished with her. Barish has worked with members of Congress to change that. As a Navy veteran myself, Congressman Andy Harris of Maryland has said, "I feel I have a duty to honor the crew members on the USS Cyclops who never returned home to Baltimore, and the families they left behind." Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels wrote in 1918 that there has been no more baffling mystery in the annals of the Navy than the disappearance of the USS Cyclops. There has not been a trace of the vessel, and long-continued and vigilant search of the entire region proved utterly futile. More than a century later, his words remain true. The Cyclops is still out there, somewhere beneath the Atlantic, holding on to her secrets. 309 men sleep in her rusting hull, their names inscribed on memorials from Baltimore to Birmingham, from Norfolk to Sacramento, from Lisbon, Iowa, to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. They came from all walks of life. They answered their country's call. They boarded a ship that should have brought them home. They never returned. The sea keeps her secrets well. She does not give up her dead easily. The Atlantic has claimed thousands of ships over the centuries, from wooden galleons laden with Spanish gold to steel dreadnoughts bristling with guns. Most of them leave something behind, some trace of their existence, some evidence of their end. A lifeboat washed ashore, a piece of wreckage tangled in a fishing net, a body in a life jacket floating face down in the swells. The ocean is cruel, but it usually offers closure. The Cyclops offered nothing. She took her 309 men into the deep and left no evidence that she had ever existed. No wooden bucket, no cork life preserver, no piece of manganese ore washed up on a Caribbean beach. She is out there still, somewhere in the darkness, her steel hull slowly collapsing under the pressure of the abyss, her crew resting in compartments that will never see light again. That is how tragedy happens at sea. Not always in battle, not always against an enemy you can see. Sometimes it happens because of decisions made by men who put schedules ahead of safety, because of warnings that were ignored, because of secrets that were kept. The Cyclops was doomed before she ever left Rio de Janeiro. The cracked engine, the overloaded holds, the imprisoned executive officer, the inexperienced crew, the captain no one trusted. All of it combined to send her to the bottom of the Atlantic, and all of it was preventable. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from naval history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.